We put a lot of emphasis on reading and writing, but we give short shrift to listening and speaking.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, Andrew, as you know, a few years ago, well, actually more like 5 years ago, we updated our logo for the, fifth time?
Yes, and we added the tagline.
Yeah, and I like that tagline. Listen, speak, read, write, think. Directives. Let's do this.
Yeah, it was the result of the talk that I did around that time. I came up with it called the 4 Language Arts. And that became the theme for a lot of things. Tagline, Magalog title.
Arts of Language. This podcast,
because we're going to start with
Listening,
which is the first
yes,
of the 5. I mean, there's the 4 plus the 5th, the quintessential.
Right.
Yeah. Well, listening. Is it important?
I think every mother would say, absolutely. How can I get my kid to listen to me?
And teachers?
And teachers want their students to listen to them. Absolutely.
Sure. We have a belief that if we can listen, we can learn better, more easily.
Well, yes. And
not only that, it helps us with everything else we want to do, especially in the area of arts of language. So, when I first came to this idea, it was the result of a conversation I was having with the superintendent of a school district in Eastern Washington. And I said in that conversation, I don't like the term language arts because it's broadly used and it usually conjures up kind of a long list of not nice things. So when you say language arts, you immediately start thinking of phonics and reading and comprehension and then handwriting and spelling and composition and grammar and public speaking and who knows what else.
A lot of which we have products that support the teaching of those exact things.
Right, but the term is just not pleasant for me, at least. And that's what I shared with him. I don't like the term.
Right.
And his response was, well, that's because you don't know what they are. And so I took kind of a humble pill there and said, well, okay, what are they? And he said, well, in a more classical sense, there's 4 of them. And they are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then he said something that resonated with me very clearly. He said, and the latter 2 are predicated on the former 2.
So writing and reading require a good foundation of listening and speaking.
Exactly. And then he pointed out the thing that caused me to realize how smart he actually was. He said, one of our problems in the schools is that we put a lot of emphasis on reading and writing, but we give short shrift to listening and speaking. Why? Well, we can test, we can assess reading and writing. So we teach to the test, but we can't easily assess and therefore do not attend to the teaching of listening and speaking.
So can you actually teach someone how to listen?
Well, that's the question.
And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Here to talk about it. I don't know teach so much as cultivate. Nurture might be another word. One thing that's very interesting about the word listen, or the gerund listening, is that we have another word that is similar in meaning but not quite. It's analogous but not an exact synonym, and that would be hear.
Right.
Hearing. We have both of these words, and they have a slightly different nuance. Hear. Well, we all hear. Everybody hears. Unless you're hearing impaired or deaf, you can't not hear. You hear all the time, whether you want to or not.
Right.
and I'm sure we've all been in situations where we kind of wished that.
Yes.
We had the ability to close our ears in the same way we have the ability to close our eyes, but for some reason, God in his wisdom did not give us that ability.
Right.
So we're always hearing, and it's kind of accidental, right? Did you hear that? It's accidental. Whereas the word listen, it's much more of a kind of transitive, an active verb. You listen for something. You listen to something. It indicates intentionality.
Right.
And so why do we have these two words? Well, there must be a reason. We don't really have to cultivate hearing skills because that's just a natural brain function. But we do think of cultivating listening skills, which would involve what? Well, at its basic level, hearing something and not hearing something else.
Right.
Right? So focus, filtering perhaps.
Well, even as you're saying this right now, I'm thinking of what it's like for me shopping in a grocery store. The announcements where they give, I need help on aisle 5 or clean up on aisle 2 and stuff. I can't not hear those.
Oh.
I am listening for those because I worked in a grocery store and I was trained to listen to those.
So you have an instinctive tendency to rush over to aisle 2 and clean up a mess.
Or stay off of aisle 2 because I know it's there.
Yeah. So interesting. Yeah, because we filter based on our environment and our experience. And of course, when it comes to language, right, listening to language, there are some clear steps that we can take with our children, with our students, to help cultivate more attentive listening. And the most important result of that, I believe, is building the language database from which everything else becomes possible.
Right.
I mean, when you think about it, a child is extremely unlikely. In fact, almost all of us are extremely unlikely to speak a word or a combination of words that we have not first listened to, that we haven't taken in auditorily. So listening is the foundation, essentially, of our speaking ability.
Right. And therefore, everything related to language arts.
Everything related to it. Reading. You wouldn't think there would be a huge connection between reading and listening. But when you're reading, you think about it. What are you doing? Essentially, you're decoding words and saying them to yourself. And then you have to hear what you said to yourself. And you have to recognize that word as you hear yourself say it to yourself in order to know what you're reading.
Right.
You can't just watch the words go by.
Well, sometimes. but not with any comprehension.
To understand what you're reading.
Right.
So when you see a word, especially, and this is more true the younger you are, but when you see a word, you actually have to pre-know that word in order to decode it and comprehend it successfully. I always use the example of the word sleigh, right? So let's say you're a little kid and you're reading and you see this word and you try to use your word attack and phonics skills. So you say, sleigha, 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 sleigha. There is no such thing as a sleigha. Therefore, that cannot be sleigha. It must be something else. So you stare at it a while longer, and then you have that epiphany moment. That is one of them A sounds, that E-I-G-H, like in eight and way. So this word must be sleigh, and you decode it. Now, that only helps. It only works if you already know what a sleigh is.
And if you sing Jingle Bells, you know what it is.
If you learn Jingle Bells, or if you've heard a book where someone read and contained the word sleigh in context, or maybe you had some life experience, you live in a far and remote, cold, awful place where they still use sleighs, or you saw a fake sleigh with a fake Santa in a mall, but you must have some context for that word. Otherwise, looking at it on the page and saying sleigh doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And it might as well be a sleigha.
Right.
So when children are reading, if they haven't heard the word at least a little bit in a context that gives that word meaning, they won't have the comprehension when reading it.
Right.
And then, of course, with With writing, that's very much dependent on everything, but it's still that same thing where you have to say something to yourself and hear what you said to yourself and hold it in your mind long enough to write it down.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is dependent, really, on listening and hearing the language and building the database in that way.
Okay, so what we're talking about today then is the foundation for everything. Oh my goodness, we better find out, how do we do this? And I'm thinking of the talk, and of course I know you are too, cultivating language arts, preschool through high school. So I would like just to hear your tips on helping each of those 5 categories, preschool, primary, elementary, middle school, high school. How can we help those students at any age become better listeners, starting with preschool? I'm particularly interested in this, as you know.
You are. Well, it's interesting because we're all about language, but I'm going to start with music.
Okay.
And you know my background. I spent the first 15 years of my adult life as a full-time violin and kinder music teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So I studied this a lot. And what has been very interesting moving into this world of teaching writing and language stuff is the similarities, the parallels, and how listening to music is really the very first step in helping children do the most important thing in understanding language, which is differentiating tones.
Oh,
right?
sure. Okay.
So language is pretty much just tones, right? Soft tones, harsh tones, long tones, chopped tones, going up tones, going down tones. And if you didn't know the language I was speaking, for example, if I said, "Hahoya, hahoya, hahoya," you would have no idea. That wouldn't be a word to you. It would be
a song,
a repetitive tonal sequence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if I held a pencil, right, and I said, "Hahoya, hahoya," and showed you the pencil every time I did that, you would very quickly get the idea that a hahoya is a pencil, although it is not in any language I am aware of.
Oh, okay. I thought you were speaking a tonal language like Japanese. No, not Japanese.
I mean, it might be
Chinese, or
but
Vietnamese.
what my point is that it's connecting the concept with the tonal structure that creates language. And then it's that ability to differentiate increasingly subtle differences in tone that allows us to expand our vocabulary. And it's vocabulary that allows rational thought. In fact, one dramatic example, I think most people have seen one or more versions of Helen Keller's story, The Miracle Worker.
Right.
And you remember, what was that moment where Helen got it, where Annie broke through?
It has something to do with the water.
Water, yes. So she was able to make the letters in her hand for water and connect that symbolic idea with the reality of water. And that was kind of the moment of breakthrough where then Helen Keller was able to understand words have meaning and words are constructed with letters. And of course, she went on to be multilingual and write brilliant stuff and give speeches in public and all sorts of incredible things. So in the world of music education, we have noticed that children who have good exposure to the right kind of music at a young age generally tend to benefit from that in all areas as well, because that's tone in its simplest form. So what I've been encouraging parents and grandparents of young children is to do focused listening.
Okay.
This is something we talked about a lot in early childhood education. And it's a little different than what we get in daily life, which kind of for many is random listening. It's whatever music you bump into on a YouTube video or at the supermarket or the song that mom plays or whatever. Instead, focused listening would be a short period of time using probably instrumental. I would recommend not vocal, but instrumental. Probably an excerpt of some great piece from some great composer. And you don't have to have much knowledge of music appreciation or composers to do this. If you know the name of the composer and he's dead, it's probably good. In fact, you can just, do a search for, greatest hits of Bach or Mozart, and then find a small little excerpt, maybe just a couple minutes to start, and play that same little excerpt every day, or maybe several times spread throughout the day for, say, a week. So that child can hear the same 2 or 3 minutes of that great piece of music, 5, 10, 15 times in 1 week time.
Okay.
And, of course, several things will happen. One is they will start to anticipate it coming, right? And, of course, we know that familiarity creates anticipation. If I start saying a poem and you know this poem, you're waiting for the next part. If I start singing a song, you're waiting for the next part. This actually is kind of a principle of working with severely language-delayed children, brain-injured children who have a real significant problem, is to use the same little poem again and again and then leave off the last word because they are anticipating it and they will want to fulfill it by completing the poem.
Okay.
And so you can create some very rudimentary imitation-based language skills. But with music, even more is happening. It's sensitizing them to the differentiations in tone, which then accelerates their ability to differentiate in language. It is building a pattern and recognition. And if it's something that's good and beautiful, then it's also nourishing their spirit. And then you could, the next week, choose maybe the next little section of that same piece or a section of a different piece. You could maybe do composer a month.
Oh, I like that,
and have a Bach month and a Beethoven month and a Mozart month and a Handel month and then start over with another Bach month. And I'm talking just small little excerpts.
Right.
And then encourage the child, as possible, to maybe close his or her eyes. Don't do something else. Just listen.
Focused listening.
Because part of listening is not doing something else, right? I mean, oftentimes, I'm sure you've had this experience. I'm doing something, my wife says something, and then I realize she was talking to me, and then I have to stop what I'm doing and say, I'm sorry, but I didn't hear what you said. And then I have to not do something that might distract me from hearing what she wants me to hear. So part of developing listening skills is isolation. It's not doing something else. So with young children, this is a very good thing.
Very good thing,
Yeah. Then as children get older, you can increase the length of time.
So preschool time.
Sure. And so that's one, I think, very important thing. And I don't think we're likely to accidentally do that well. We're likely to accidentally have music in the environment, but not with the focus and the repetition that gives it the real power of connecting those neurons and creating an affinity.
So are there any other strategies you would recommend for developing listening skills in preschoolers, or can we go on to primary?
No, absolutely. Because, of course, the brain is growing faster during the first 6 years or so of life than it ever will at any other time.
Right.
In fact, some estimates are you make 80-some% of all the neural connections you'll make in your entire life in the first 6, 7 years.
Wow.
So
I better get busy with my granddaughter.
Well, and of course, everything is new and exciting and rich, but language, Suzuki noted, everyone has noted that it is a high sensitivity time for acquiring nuanced language. So, of course, we do those things which parents have always done with their children at that age. We read them picture books. This is an interesting observation with picture books. Children will be very happy to hear the same book again and again and again and again more times than you can be happy reading it, sometimes back to back. And why is that? Why do children want to hear that same story and see those same pictures and hear those same words? Because it's feeding them. It's feeding them intellectually, because the more they know the story, the more they can anticipate, the more they can enter in an imaginative way. But likewise, when they hear the same words being said in the same way, again and again with repetition, they start to memorize little patterns of words. and they start to anticipate patterns of words. And sooner or later, some of those very patterns will come out in their speech. And so the repetition is hugely valuable, and they are naturally wired for this. So in a normal environment with a parent or a grandparent and a 2 or 3, 4 or 5-year-old child, and you have an abundant supply of children's books, and hopefully some classics like Blueberries for Sal and Ping, right? And you just keep reading those again and again and again and again, that's actually helping them anticipate, therefore focus. The pictures help them focus, help them hear and imagine, and the syntax and vocabulary are developing in a wonderful way, in a much more solid way than would be perhaps if you never read the same book twice.
Right.
And you always had new books. Fortunately, nobody's rich enough to always have new books. You always have a set of books, and usually within that set, maybe you've got 100, there's the 10 favorites that get read 10 times as many as the others.
Yep.
So that, of course, has been done for, I think as long as there were children's books in any form available. And then, of course, the tradition of nursery rhymes and poems and songs. I began teaching Kindermusik in 1990, and there was already quite a bit of research at that point to show that the culture of nursery rhymes and little songs that parents used to sing to their children was leaving. It was disappearing from American homes. And one of our goals as a Kindermusik teacher and as part of the movement of early childhood music and movement was to restore that relationship and culture of a parent bouncing a child on his or her knee and saying trot, trot to London town and all of those things that were almost universally known and done probably until the modern technology invaded the home in a fairly aggressive and abrupt manner. So we would, bring parents and 3 and 4-year-olds. Well, actually, we started with 18 months to 3 years old, and then 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and we would bring parents in with these, toddlers, basically, and preschool children, and teach the moms and dads sometimes how to use repetition, doing motions and nursery rhymes and little songs and what we might call ditties. Right? With their children at home. That was the whole purpose of the class, was to teach the mom or parent what to do at home to restore this musicality, both rhythm and tone, but also song and language.
I love that.
So, Kindermusik, and there's others. There's Musikgarten, there's Sing With Me. There's quite a number of different programs that parents could look into if they are interested in a class-like experience. Some people are fortunate enough to have had parents who did that type of thing and sang songs and did nursery rhymes with children. But, the least thing you could do is just get a book of Mother Goose.
Yes.
One of my favorite books that I've ever read was written by a man named John Senior. And in it, he made a very interesting observation. He said, you must have a foundation of nursery rhymes, right, to love Willie Shakespeare.
Willie.
Because it's some of that same rhythm and structure, that iambic pentameter feeling that comes out later. And that's set mainly through listening and repeating at a very young age.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot for preschool, primary. What would you add to it?
Well, you're obviously going to move away from the simple picture books and be reading books that maybe have fewer pictures, chapter books. Those are going to require a longer attention span.
Oh, right.
They're going to cultivate that ability to listen for longer periods of time. And parents, of course, some have the habit and tradition of reading bedtime stories to elementary age children. Some don't. Which I think is kind of sad. I remember with great fondness, the bedtime story part of the evening ritual. In fact, it seemed like it just wasn't possible to go to sleep without a bedtime story.
Right.
And yet again, that culture's kind of kind of dying. So to do that, I think teachers in schools, if they could just steal 10, 15 minutes a day and start reading a chapter book to their children in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, that would have huge benefits. They would be fairly intangible.
Right.
You couldn't test them in the same way you could test reading comprehension. But like Dr. Sully mentioned to me so long ago, if we don't cultivate that greater attentiveness through listening, we won't see it come in independent reading as well. I think it's great if you can continue with music, exposing children to broader styles, going to some dress rehearsals, which are usually free, or concerts if you can afford them, having them fall in love with what is good and beautiful in terms of a more classical, pure music sense. They won't bump into that in daily life too often.
Right.
But you can create opportunities. I have a grandson who is almost 5, and last time I saw him, he said, "Grandpa, do you want to listen to the 1812 Overture?" And I said, "Sure, let's
Cannons
do it."
and all.
And so his mom got out the YouTube, and we watched on YouTube an orchestra performing. And he sat there and listened to the whole thing, waiting, of course, for the cannons and all. But she's managed to cultivate in him this wonderful appreciation for good and great music by using technology in the way that it can bring high-quality performance and content into the home, which would have been very difficult. When I was 5 years old, you actually had to go to the music center and sit there and try not to move around too much and make noise. So I'm looking forward to when I can try to take him to a live performance of one of the pieces that he has come to love. So expanding the listening, both on the length and complexity of the books as well as the music side. And then, that's the age at which kids are more interested in conversation.
Okay.
Right? They want to ask you questions. And if you don't have any questions, they'll ask you more questions. So you try to ask them questions. And so just in the dialogue of listening and speaking to each other in kind of a focused way, not necessarily a limited way, but without distraction, with the purpose. I think a lot of this can happen, while driving. Driving is kind of fun with children. It can be fun. It can also be miserable. But, I like to drive for a long time with my 7-year-old grandson, because he just loves to tell stories and listen to stories. And he'll always say, "Grandpa, do you know any stories?"
Oh, yeah.
And if I say, "Oh, I can't really think of any," he goes, "Well, I know the story."
Right, nice.
And of course, at a certain age, and that kind of depends just on maturity and technology that's available, they can start listening to audiobooks as well. Right. And boy, I know my grandsons, both the 5 and the 7-year-old, they will devour audiobooks and play with Legos and listen to audiobook for an hour or 2 hours or 3 even.
So this is a little different than the focused listening. It's okay for them to be listening to these books while they're doing something else.
Yes, because I think we've all had that experience when our hands and eyes are kind of busy, but not doing anything that requires a tremendous amount of attention. Right. We can still listen to what's going on. And for some people, it's easier for them to listen to what's going on if their hands are busy.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that was true for my ADHD son. Yeah.
I actually have sometimes people come to my seminars or come to a conference talk and pull out their knitting or crocheting, and they'll do that while I'm giving my talk. And I know that they know that they actually can listen better because their hands are busy doing something. Then, I think talking about middle school and high school, one of the mistakes that it is easy for us to make is to kind of stop reading to children out loud when they read on their own. And especially in a large family, it's kind of easy to favor the younger children. Oh, you can read. Oh, great. You can go do Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to yourself. And that'll free me up to do Ping and the Beautiful Yangtze River one more time with the 4-year-old. But I would argue it's actually when children start to read more independently, that's the time when it is most important to read to them at a level above their own comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
Because they'll read what they can read, but they won't read something they can't read, right? If it's too hard, too many long words, too small a print, not enough pictures. You can read that, and then it's not so hard. And as you're reading, if there's a word that is unfamiliar, you can stop and define that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a person or a place mentioned, you can stop and kind of put that in context, give a little historical information. If there's an idiom or an allusion that might be unfamiliar to the child, you can stop and kind of explain that. And what is that? That's called creating understanding.
Right.
That's creating comprehension.
Right.
And I do feel that if we wanted to solve the reading comprehension problem in schools all over the country or world, the most important thing we could do is to restore a culture where people read aloud
Yep.
together to each other, parents to children, parents to teachers, older children to younger children.
We would be remiss if we did not mention in this podcast our dear friend, Sarah McKinsey.
We would be remiss with the Read Aloud Revival and
Yes.
her book, The Read Aloud Family.
Yes, and she has so many book recommendations for all ages of children. I think mostly with the goal of reading them out loud to your children. That's her
Yeah,
whole hope.
she heard my talk once upon a time and just lit a fire under her that knows no bounds now.
Yeah.
And it's so wonderful. She's just reaching hundreds and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of parents with this vitalizing message because truly, in my experience, that is the number one predictor of being a competent and confident writer as an adult is having been read to out loud as a child.
Right.
So
that brings us full circle. Listening is the foundation for good writing.
yeah, and
Wow.
everything in between,
Wow.
which we will talk about next time.
Yes, we will.
All
Thank you,
right.
Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudewa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.